Okay, in this segment I'll give a few examples of how you can use the General Conference corpus or collection of text to look at the frequency of a word or phrase over time. In order to do these searches, make sure that where it says show down here that it's set to decade rather than speaker. And for most of these you want to choose chart. You just want to see a nice chart of the frequency over time. So let's take a simple example like atonement. And so when we search for that, we see that per million words, so it does take into account the total number of words in each decade. You can see that it's increased over time. You can click on any of these decades, see the word being used in context. In this case, it doesn't mean that 100 or 150 years ago they weren't talking about the concept of the atonement. They just were not using the exact word atonement. So you need to keep those two separate. This is another example. Here we're looking for something very simple, just the word she. And you can see that in the 1970s, 1980s, it increases quite a bit as we have more women talking in General Conference, and even among the men who are talking in General Conference, more reference to women. So just a very simple search like that can show us something rather interesting. So those are examples of words that have increased in frequency over time. Zion, for example, is a word that has decreased in frequency over time. So 100 years ago it was used quite a bit, not used very much right now. Another example is we could look, for example, at correlate, correlated, correlation. And you can see a big bump in the 1960s when the correlation movement under Harold B. Lee started. Sometimes it's just a change in terminology. So for example, for many years we referred to those people who were not LDS as non-members. And you can see that that's decreased quite a bit. To now it's used really not hardly at all in General Conference. But if you were to look, for example, at other faiths, members of other faiths, you'd see that that's increased quite a bit over the last few years. Just one last example of this, just a little bit more tricky than some of the other ones that we've been doing. If you look at celestial marriage, for example, you'll see that it decreased quite a bit in the late 1800s and then has come back, not overly frequent, but it's used a fair amount since the 1950s. What's going on here is if you look at the examples from the 1800s, celestial marriage refers to plural marriage. And then when plural marriage goes away in the late 1800s, the term celestial marriage goes away as well. And nowadays celestial marriage is used, it just means something quite different than it did 130 or 140 years ago. So all of these are examples, just a handful of examples showing how you can use the corpus to look at the frequency of a word or a phrase over time.